Okay, so today we're diving into an ethical dilemma.
Ooh, I love a good ethical dilemma.
Yeah, these are the situations where it can feel like there's no right answer.
Yeah, definitely.
And this one's especially close to home for a lot of people because it involves a baby animal.
Oh,
So the situation is this: someone finds a 4-week-old orphaned gray squirrel.
ah,
I know, right? Eyes aren't even open yet.
oh, so tiny.
Yeah, and they're faced with this question of what to do with it, and
Right, because you can't just, keep it.
exactly. So our deep dive today is going to use an article from the Veterinary Journal in Practice called "What Should You Do with an Orphaned Baby Gray Squirrel?"
Okay, so really digging into this specific situation.
Yeah, we're going to try to figure out, what are the options, what are the ethical considerations, the legal
How many
ramifications.
layers to unpack?
Exactly.
Yeah,
So before we get into all of that, let's start by understanding why gray squirrels are such a hot topic in the UK.
right, because they're not native, are they?
Exactly. They're considered an invasive species.
Oh.
They were actually introduced from North America back in the 19th century.
Wow, so they've been here a while.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they've had a pretty significant impact on our native red squirrel populations and the ecosystem as a whole.
Right, I've heard they can carry a disease.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. It's called squirrelpox virus.
Okay.
And it's deadly to red squirrels, but gray squirrels are immune to it.
Oh, wow, so they're spreading it, but not affected by it themselves.
Exactly. And on top of that, they're just very good at adapting to the environment.
Oh, so they're outcompeting the Reds for resources.
Exactly. They're better at finding food, building nests, and just generally surviving, which has led to red squirrels being pushed out of much of their historical territory.
That's so sad. I love red squirrels.
Yeah, it's a real shame. And it's not just about the squirrels either.
What do you mean?
Well, gray squirrels can cause a lot of damage to trees.
Oh, right, by stripping the bark.
Exactly. And that affects the overall health of woodlands and biodiversity.
So it's a much bigger issue than it might seem at first glance.
Exactly, which is why the UK government has had to step in with legislation to try to manage the gray squirrel population.
Okay, so there are laws about what you can and can't do with them.
Yeah, and that's where things get really complicated because there are specific laws in place that make it illegal to release gray squirrels back into the wild.
So if you find a baby squirrel, you can't just raise it and let it go.
Exactly. It's a real catch-22 because you want to help this animal, but you also have to follow the law, and that's what makes this situation with the orphan gray squirrel such a dilemma.
So we've got an ethical dilemma and a legal one.
Exactly. So let's dive into the options presented in this article and really try to unpack the pros and cons of each one.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, so the first option that might come to mind is contacting a wildlife rescue center.
Right, because they're the experts.
Yeah, seems like the natural thing to do, but is it that straightforward?
I don't know.
Well, the article points out that because of these recent changes in legislation, many wildlife rescue centers have actually lost their licenses to release gray squirrels.
Oh, wow. So even if you take it to a rescue center, they might not be able to do much.
Exactly. Some may offer temporary care, but they might not be equipped for the long haul. And what happens to the squirrel then is uncertain.
So it's not a guaranteed happy ending.
Not necessarily. So taking the squirrel to a rescue center might not be the simple solution we'd hope for.
Okay, so what's next? What about sanctuaries?
Yeah, sanctuaries seem like a potential solution, a place where they can live out their days safely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the article hints that there are some ethical considerations with this option, too. So before we go any further, what should we know about sanctuaries and the challenges they face?
Well, you have to remember that keeping any wild animal in captivity has ethical implications.
Okay, that makes sense. They're meant to be free.
Exactly. Even the best sanctuaries, while providing food and shelter, can't fully replicate that wild freedom that squirrels need to really thrive.
So even with good intentions, a sanctuary might not be the ideal life for a squirrel.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It really is.
So what about the do-it-yourself approach?
You mean raising the squirrel at home and releasing it later?
Yeah, exactly. Is that even an option?
Yeah.
It's tempting, right? Especially
Yeah.
when you've got this cute little squirrel in your care.
Yeah. It's easy to think, oh, I can totally do this.
But it's important to understand that raising a wild animal requires a deep understanding of their needs.
More than just, giving them food and a warm place to sleep.
Exactly. There are so many nuances that an untrained person might overlook.
Yeah, like what kind of things could go wrong even with the best intentions?
Well, for example, orphan squirrels need a very specific diet and feeding schedule to thrive.
Oh, so it's not just like any nuts and seeds will do?
No, not at all. And then there's the whole aspect of mental and physical stimulation.
Right. They need to develop the skills they'd need to survive in the wild.
Exactly. Things like foraging for food, avoiding predators.
Yeah, that's not something we humans instinctively know how to teach.
Or imagine trying to teach a squirrel how to crack open a nut or climb a tree to escape a cat.
Yeah, it's not exactly intuitive for us.
So releasing a hand-reared squirrel could actually do more harm than good.
Because they might not be equipped to deal with the realities of the wild.
Exactly. They might not know how to find food or shelter or how to avoid danger.
And even if you raise it perfectly, releasing a gray squirrel is still illegal.
Yeah, we can't forget about the legal side of things.
Right, you'd be unintentionally breaking the law no matter how much you care for the animal.
So it's really not a viable option.
It seems like even the most well-meaning actions can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's a tough lesson to learn.
So we've ruled out sanctuaries and DIY rehab. What about returning the squirrel to where it was found? Maybe its mother is still searching for it?
That's a common thought.
Wouldn't it be the most humane option just to reunite it with its family?
It seems like it,
The-
right? But this option also has its share of problems, both legally and practically.
I'm surprised that returning the squirrel could be an issue. Can you explain why?
Well, firstly, UK law has something called the Abandonment of Animals Act, and this makes it an offense to abandon any animal where it might suffer unnecessarily.
So leaving a tiny squirrel alone, even in its original location, could be seen as breaking this law.
Potentially, yes.
Wow, I never thought about that.
It's not always obvious, is it?
So even trying to reunite the squirrel with its family could land someone in legal trouble, but beyond the legal aspect, wouldn't returning it still be the best chance for survival?
There's no guarantee of that, unfortunately.
What do you mean?
The squirrel might have been orphaned because its mother was hit by a car or fell victim to a predator.
Oh.
And sadly, leaving a baby squirrel alone in the same spot could expose it to further danger.
So even with good intentions, we might be putting the squirrel at even greater risk.
It's a difficult balance, isn't it?
This is a lot to process. We've discussed rescue centers, sanctuaries, raising it ourselves and returning it to where it was found, and each option has its own set of challenges.
Yeah, it's not looking good.
That leaves us with the one option nobody wants to talk about, but we have to. Euthanasia.
It's the most difficult option to consider. And believe me, it's a last resort.
I can imagine.
But as the article points out, sometimes it truly is the most humane course of action.
I can see how this could be a tough decision for someone facing this situation. What does the article say about how this would be carried out?
The article stresses that euthanasia must be done humanely,
Okay.
meaning the squirrel would be sedated or given an anesthetic before medication is used to end its life.
So it's done as peacefully as possible.
Exactly. Vets are highly trained to perform this procedure in a way that minimizes pain and distress for the animal.
That's reassuring to know. But even so, it raises some challenging ethical questions.
Absolutely, the article doesn't shy away from the complexity of this.
It feels heavy even just discussing it. Is it ever right to end an animal's life based solely on its species?
That's the heart of the dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah, we've seen that all the other options come with their own risks and ethical considerations.
So is there even a right answer here? It's something you really have to grapple with.
It's certainly a lot to consider. It seems like there's no easy solution, and every choice has its own set of pros and cons, both legally and ethically. What advice does the article give to help someone navigate this complex situation?
Well, the article really emphasizes the importance of reaching out to experts.
You mean experienced wildlife professionals?
Exactly. They have the most up-to-date information on the laws and best practices for dealing with these situations.
So rather than trying to figure this out alone, the best first step is to reach out to the professionals who can help guide you through this process.
Absolutely. Trying to be a hero can sometimes do more harm than good. Let the experts help you navigate this ethical maze.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I started thinking this was a simple case of rescuing a baby squirrel, but it's so much more complicated than that.
It's an ethical minefield.
And we haven't even covered all the options yet. There's one more the article discusses that we should explore. Okay, so we've talked about rescue centers, sanctuaries, DIY rehab, and even the difficult topic of euthanasia.
Yeah, we've really gone through the gamut, haven't we?
We have, but there's actually one more option the article discusses that we need to address.
Oh, really? What's that?
It's the option of keeping the squirrel as a pet.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I can see how someone might be drawn to that idea. You find this helpless creature, you nurse it back to health, you form a bond with it.
Right. It's natural to want to keep it safe.
Exactly. And it might seem preferable to other outcomes, but Let's set aside the legal issues for a moment. What are the ethical considerations of keeping a wild animal like a squirrel as a pet?
Well, on the one hand, keeping the squirrel in a loving home where it's safe and cared for might seem like the best option.
Right, especially compared to some of the alternatives.
Well, but on the other hand, keeping a wild animal as a pet raises some serious concerns about the squirrel's well-being.
Okay, so even if someone truly wants to provide the best possible care, a home environment might not be the right place for a squirrel to thrive.
Exactly. Wild animals have very specific needs that are difficult, if not impossible, to meet in a domestic setting.
Like what kind of need?
Well, they need space to roam and explore opportunities to climb and forage and social interaction with their own kind.
Right, those are all things that are hard to replicate in a typical home.
Think about how active squirrels are in their natural habitat. Could you provide that kind of environment in your living room?
Probably not. So it's not just about providing food and shelter, it's about fulfilling their natural instincts and behaviors.
Exactly. And what could happen to a squirrel that's deprived of those things?
Well, I imagine they wouldn't be very happy.
Yeah, they could develop all sorts of problems. They might become stressed, anxious, or even aggressive.
Oh, wow.
And they might start exhibiting unhealthy behaviors like pacing, excessive chewing, or even self-mutilation.
That's so sad.
Yeah. These are all signs that the squirrel is not thriving in its environment. And we also can't forget about the potential risks to human health.
Right, because squirrels can carry diseases.
Exactly. So there's a safety aspect to consider as well.
So while keeping the squirrel as a pet might seem like a compassionate solution, at first glance, it could actually lead to more suffering for the animal in the long run.
Yeah, it's a tough reality to face.
It is, and it highlights why it's so important to consult with wildlife experts in these situations.
They can provide guidance that considers the squirrel's well-being, the ecosystem, and the legal framework.
Right, so they can help you weigh all the factors and make the best decision for everyone involved.
Exactly.
Wow, this whole deep dive has been a journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
We started with what seemed like a straightforward rescue mission, but as we've delved deeper, we've uncovered layer upon layer of complexity.
It's amazing how something so seemingly simple can become so complicated when you start to consider all the angles.
It really underscores how even the simplest acts of kindness, like wanting to care for an orphan squirrel, can become ethical dilemmas when you consider the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's about understanding the interconnectedness of our actions and the impact they have on the natural world.
So what have we learned today? What's the key takeaway for our listener?
I think the biggest takeaway is that wildlife rescue is not as simple as it seems. It's not just about picking up an animal and taking it home.
Right, there's more to it than that.
It's about understanding the legal framework, the ecological implications, and the ethical considerations involved in every decision.
And sometimes the most compassionate choice is to step back and let the experts handle the situation.
Exactly. They have the knowledge and the resources to give these animals the best possible chance.
So if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember to reach out to your local wildlife rescue organization.
They're there to help.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the complexities of the world around us.